Welcome to the AVAIL podcast, where we dig deep and talk about the art of leadership. My name is Virgil Sierra, and today we're sitting down with Steve Chalke. Steve is a British Baptist minister, a former United Nations Special Advisor on Human Trafficking, a social activist, and he's the founder of the Oasis Charitable Trust, leading over 6,000 staff members, over 60 schools, and serving over 33,000 students. Chalke is the author of a large number of books, including his latest release entitled A Manifesto for Hope. In this episode, Steve will share the extraordinary story of how God gave him a vision as a teenager that would eventually come alive years later. So, lean in, leaders, and let's get started. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the AVAIL podcast, where we dig deep and talk about this art called leadership. My name is Virgil Sierra, lead pastor of Vertical Church, aka Iglesia Vertical, here in South Florida. We are one church, two languages, and I'm your host for this AVAIL podcast every week, where we connect with amazing leaders. And did I mention global leaders? Today, we have a global leader all the way from the UK, none other than Steve Chalke. Steve, what a pleasure and what a privilege it is to have you on the AVAIL podcast. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling really good that we're connected. Isn't it an amazing thing? Right across the Atlantic instantly like that. You know, back here in the UK, it's been a cold, dark day and it's raining. It's pouring outside still. So here I am in the warm talking to you. Couldn't be better.
Well, over here in South Florida, it is sunny and it's a beautiful day. So maybe we can bring some of that in there to the conversation, keep you
That's
warm
what I
over there.
guess. I guess it would be that. Yeah.
I'm really excited. I'm really excited about talking with you and hearing about what God is doing through you, through Oasis Restore. We'll even talk a little bit on the back end about your book. But I would love for our AVAIL audience to get to know you a little bit. Can you share a little bit about yourself for those who are leaning in and getting to know Steve Chalke?
Well, yeah, like you know, my name's Steve Chalke. I'm half Indian, half English. My father was born in Chennai, as it's now called, Madras, in India, and came to this country. My mother is English, and so I grew up in this mixed race home. And it was a very poor home as well, because when my father came here with very, very dark skin, some of the racism meant that that was around at that time just left him out, you know, didn't make room for him. I remember walking up streets with him and people crossing to the other side of the street just because they didn't want to walk past this dark Asian man that they didn't understand. Perhaps they thought, well, I just don't know how to understand his language. But that had a huge impact on my childhood in two ways, I think. My dad was a Christian and always extraordinarily positive, even when knocked back. And he found it very hard to find work because of his color. And some of my mum's family wouldn't visit the house when he was there because of his color. So I think that impacted me as a child. And what happened because of the poverty we grew up in, and it was real poverty, I went to not a good school. From 11 years old, I went to a school that didn't allow us to take the exams we needed to make it through life, who told us we'd work in factories, we'd work with our hands, not our heads. And the future didn't look very bright at all. But then an extraordinary thing happened. I fell in love with a girl. She was 15, I was 14. Her name was Mary. And I found out that she went to this youth group at church on Friday nights. And I started going every Friday night to a Baptist church, actually. And one Friday night, her best friend told my best friend that Mary didn't fancy me and she'd never go out with me ever because I was the ugliest boy on the planet. And that night changed my life, because I wandered home about a 5-minute walk from the church hall building to my home. And I thought, I'm never going to that youth club again because Mary Hooper thinks I'm ugly. And then I realized this. I thought, hang on a minute, but the story they tell me down at that church is a lot better than the story they tell me at my school. At my school, they tell me my life doesn't amount to much. At the church, they say
Right.
my life's got potential. I'm made by God. Even if I never discover what that potential is, it sits there. And so I decided I was going to go back. And I decided that if I was going to go back, I better be a Christian. And I decided that if I was going to be a Christian, I better become a church leader. It's a strange thing. This all happened in about 5 minutes. And then I decided if I was going to be a church leader, I ought to set up a school worth going to. And I should set up a house for kids who weren't cared for by their parents. My mum and dad were always brilliant. But I knew I had friends at this school who were never loved, never cared for. I'd set up a house for them. And I should set up a hospital, some healthcare, because I knew that that was important in life. So I got it in. My mum asked me, had I had a good evening? I didn't tell her that Mary Hooper didn't like me, but I did say, I've decided that when I grow up, I'm going to set up a school and a house for kids to come live in that no one cares about, and a hospital, and I'm going to be a church leader. And she looked at me and she said, very nice. And that was it. So I had that moment when all I can say is it was God given. It didn't come from in me. It came from out there. I left that youth club
Wow.
not having a clue what to do with my life. I got home, and ever since then, I've known exactly what I should be doing.
Unbelievable. You know what that reminds me of, Steve? It reminds me of the power of an invitation. The power of an invitation. Somebody invited you to church and it literally transformed the rest of your life. I don't know much. I don't know about Mary Hooper's story, but I'm glad she invited you to church. I'm glad she invited you to
I
church.
still know her. I
Wow.
still know her, Mary. In fact, I was with her sister, got a slightly older sister just the other week. So I often tell the story about Mary. Mary always says to me, you made me famous through that story. But I say to her, it's through that my life, I had that God-given gift of purpose.
Wow.
They say there are only two important days in your life, the day you're born and the day you find out why. And I had the privilege of discovering what my life was about that evening.
Wonderful. I'd love for you to unpack a little bit about Oasis and the work you're doing in the UK, even worldwide. Talk to us a little bit about Oasis.
Well, I went back to the youth club the next week, and I sat down with these guys who led this youth club. I mean, they were old. I mean, they were really old and wise. I liked them. I sat with them and I said, look, when I grow up, I want to be a Christian. I want to become a church leader, and I want to start a school and a house and a hospital. And they looked at me and go, yeah, that's really great. And they said, you better train as a Baptist minister. You better do theology. Well, I'd never heard of theology. Honestly, I'd never heard of theology. I went to the kind of school where you didn't hear about career opportunities, or I didn't know what biology was, let alone theology. But and so I pursued this route. Now, looking back on it all these years later, I realized that they weren't old at all. They looked about as so old, ancient, they were just all about to retire. But in truth, they were all in their very early 20s, and they were all theology students. And that's why they were running the youth club in the church. Anyway, I trained as a Baptist minister. I am a Baptist minister. And I went to work for a church. And 4 years on into it, I was telling the church that I was working with, big church, a fantastic church. And I kept saying, but I want to set up a school and a house for kids who are on the streets otherwise. And I want to set up this hospital. And in the end, what they said was, after 4 years, they said, look, Steve, you can stay for a year and you can live in the house that came with your job. We won't pay you. We can't pay you anymore, but we give you free accommodation for 1 year. And you got that year to get things going. By then, I was married to my wife. Her name's Cornelia. She's another girl from the youth group. I often say to people, church youth groups are fantastic. If there's one girl that doesn't fancy you, there's another one that does. And so by then, Cornelia and I were married, and I left my job, and we embarked on this thing, which became Oasis. Cornelia said to me, if we're going to do this, we're going to have to start a house first, not a school or a hospital. And I said, why is that? And she said, because we're not intelligent enough to start a school or a hospital. So running on empty because we had nothing, we just leapt into this. Um, Eventually, it took longer than a year actually, but we got a house up and running. It's a long story, but and it's full of miracles. It really is full of miracles. But we got this house up and running, which we still run, where we take on and we give accommodation and love and care to young women who are on the streets, been abused, abandoned, they've been treated violently, no one's cared for them. So they come live with us for 6 months, a year and a half, occasionally 2 years. And what we do is we give them that new start and find them a job, get them qualifications, find them a house to live in, an apartment, and launch them, and then support them on that journey. And my wife, Cornelia, we'd only been married a few years ourselves. She said we should call this house Oasis because it's like it's like an oasis in the barren desert of life for these girls. It's like fresh
Mm,
water, restoring their souls. So we
mm.
set up a charity to run the house called Oasis. And since then, it's expanded. Back then, it was just me and then me and Cornelia. Now we employ about 6,000 staff. We run lots of houses. We run in England 54 schools. We got 33,000 children in our schools full time. We
Wow.
develop churches and youth centers and community centers and town farms and city farms. Oh, their list is endless. We work in emergency
Wow.
departments of hospitals with young people and old who turn up stabbed, victims of crime or have attempted to take their lives. All of that and lots more. And we work in some
Wow.
other countries. We work in India. In fact, we even work in the town where my dad grew up, and in some
Wow.
African countries. Always doing the same thing. Oasis exists to build healthy communities where everyone can achieve their God-given potential.
I love this. One of the things that this fires me up, Steve, to hear this because as you just said, you started kind of running on empty with very little in your hands or very little knowledge or understanding, but just the willingness to say, I'm here, God, use me. We're here, God, use us. And you're talking about 6,000 staff,
Mm.
64 schools, over 30,000 students. I mean, this is extraordinary, Steve. This is extraordinary.
Yeah, but look at my hair. I'm old. I've been doing this for a long time.
So this is great. Along that journey, one thing that is evident is leadership had to be a part of this journey because you can't get to 6,000 staff and 64 schools and all of it. You can't get there without good leadership. I'd love for you to, as you expound on um, Oasis Restore. This is kind of a I don't know if it's a newer chapter in the journey
Yeah.
the journey you've been on, but talk to us about Oasis Restore, which is kind of a whole new alternative for youth prisons. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so it's over the years in the work we've done, we only work in poor communities. And we work with young people who are disadvantaged. We work in socioeconomically deprived communities. We work with people who are not loved, not cared for, no one notices them or sees them. That's the hallmark of the work we do to build healthy communities uh,
Hmm.
and where people are. And one of the things that's run through our work is we see so many kids never fulfill their potential, and we see
Mm,
young people excluded. From they end up being excluded. That their behaviour is dysregulated. They're aggressive. People don't understand them, and so what the system does is exclude them. It gives them detentions at school. It then slowly excludes them. You're excluded from school. Once you're excluded, of course, you're easily exploited. You're exploited by others. They pimp you. They groom you. And then there's that journey into criminalization and criminal activity
Mm,
for many of them. And in our country, I don't know the facts or stats for America, but I guess they're pretty similar. If you analyze who ends up in jail in the UK, it's 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 poor kids. It's kids that have been
mm,
what we call looked after. They've not been loved. That means they've been fostered. You know, they've not got loving parents who wrap their arms around them and have nurtured them well. It's kids who are dyslexic. It's kids that are autistic. It's kids that are atypical learners. It's young people who are black or brown. It's the minorities. They make up the huge proportion of people who end up in jail, end up in crime. And that's not right, is it? That's not justice.
mm,
And so our work in communities that are challenged across these years slowly led me to challenge government in this country. And I was talking
mm,
to, I got into a conversation 14 years ago in the year 2010, and with the what we call the Secretary of State for Justice. He's the senior government minister for justice, and I didn't know him at all. But he was talking to me about justice, and I said, there isn't any justice for many young people in our society. There isn't any
mm,
justice. And then he agreed with me, and he said, write to me about it. So I did write to him about it, and then I wrote to him about it again. And then eventually he asked us to go and see some of his officials. And then we wrote a big paper on why our justice system doesn't work. Because it's not just the poor end up in jail, poor kids end
right.
up in jail. It's that they then go on when they're released to reoffend and reoffend and reoffend. In fact, in this country, the reoffending rate for young people who've been held in custody is always reckoned to be around 70% of them will reoffend and commit a more
Wow.
serious crime in the first year. Of course, that I always say to them, the reoffending rate isn't really the reoffending rate, it's the reconviction rate, the re-getting caught rate. It's that kids
Right.
will go and reoffend and not get caught probably within hours or days of release. Anyway, the
Hmm.
outcome of this in the end is the government said to us, and I'm simplifying a very long journey, so why don't you do something different? And that's what we've done. It's a 14-year journey. The facility we built is in the county of Kent, on the edge of a town called Rochester, and it's cost nearly £50 million to build. But it's a therapeutic centre, so young people will come to us who've murdered, attempted murder, committed violent crimes of one description or the other, and a judge and jury will sentence them to serve their time, as they call it, with us. But we're not penal, we're restorative. In fact, we've called this Oasis Restore, as he said.
I love this. I'm curious, Steve, and I know there's probably a lot of pieces along the journey. But how did you get to a place where you had a thought or an idea? Obviously, you had maybe a God ordained connection with somebody in power and authority. But how do you get to a place where you actually believe I can do something, I can make a difference? Like there's a lot of leaders leaning in right now, whether they're pastors, ministry leaders, community leaders. Um, how do you what advice, what encouragement can you give when sometimes a problem seems overwhelming and the obstacles seem um,
Yeah.
insuperable and insurmountable, right? How do you what helped you? What advice can you give us to break through and actually get get something done?
I think the thing is this, I genuinely do. It's why I started with the story of how I became a Christian. And remember what I said was this came from outside of myself. I
Mhm.
wandered up that street on the way home from that youth club, and I hadn't got a clue what to do with my life. In fact, I never even thought about what to do with my life. It wasn't that I searched and couldn't find an answer. But from
Mm-hmm.
God, I would say, I always say to everyone, came this thing from outside of myself? Now, I'm not saying that was when I was 14. I'm not saying that every day of my life I've been fixed on my true north. I've been blown off course one way or the other, and I've taken wrong
Mm-hmm.
turn-ins and, got to find my way back, etc. But I've known where I've been headed. So I had this God-given vision. I was talking to somebody earlier today who came to see me, and they were thinking about setting up a not-for-profit organization for a particular purpose. And this happens to me often now. So they said, "What advice would you give me on what I'm about to do?" And I looked at them very hard. I've got used to doing this. Looked at them very hard, and I paused, and I said, "My advice is this: don't." And then I let it just hang there. And then I said, "But if this thing burns inside you, then you must do it. But this is the truth. This will cost you everything. You are giving up your freedom. This is going to be hard. It's going to cost you everything." I said to this woman I was talking to, actually, she's a wonderful person. I said, "Every enterprise will have, in the end, lots of people who are rationally committed to it. But the founder, the leader, the visionary, the entrepreneur, they have to be irrationally committed to it." And the reason for that is this, Virgil. I've discovered this. When it's winter, when it's dark, when the funding's not there, when the people aren't with you, when the doubts are sown, when the people say it will never happen, it's only that inner thing. I must do this. This is my calling. This is my raison d'etre. This is why I'm here, that can sustain you. That's the first thing I'd say. What is your vision? Vision is everything. I often think of the story of Moses. And, so here's what I think about the story of Moses. They, the people of Israel have been slaves in Egypt, as you know, for 400 years. 400 years! That's nearly half a
Mm-hmm.
millennium. They've been stuck there in slavery. Now, in those 400 years, how many how many people would have told stories of freedom to their children? How many children of Israel would have said, "My grandfather reminds me of when we were free, when we were our own people"? How many people would have sung songs of freedom, dreamt dreams about freedom, written poems about freedom, about the end of slavery, and the et cetera, et cetera? So why was it 400 years before Moses actually takes on Pharaoh? Because the idea that the world is different, the idea that things aren't as they are, that's compelling. But Moses felt this so deeply inside, he had the courage to take on the world's biggest dictator at the time. He had the courage to take on evil, and he had the courage to fight for freedom. And I would say this lastly: Moses, like all leaders, it wasn't just that he told them that slavery wasn't their destiny, but he could point
Mm.
them to a new land. He not only told them about how to leave the old lands, but he showed them, he painted for them the promised land, the new land. I think that's the task of a leader. And I've learned through life, we got endless staff now, as you say, thousands and thousands. But the task of a
Mm.
leader is a lonely one. It's always lonely. There's much more to say, and I realize that's only half an answer, but the clock ticks on us.
No, I love that. The three things that stood out to me: irrational commitment, courage, and vision, pointing to where we got to go. I love that. I think there's so much you just unpacked there in a few minutes. This is
Yeah.
very valuable, Steve.
Yeah, I would add this. Virgil. I think it takes two types of people to make something happen. You need the pioneers and the settlers. You need the movement people who want to press forward, and you need the institution people. And the trouble with someone like me being a pioneer, a blue sky thinker, a rainmaker, or whatever people. The trouble with people like me is I can blow up an organization. I can wreck it just through the number of ideas I've got. Whereas institution people, the settlers, they can wreck an organization just through kind of getting bogged down in the bureaucracy of it. And what we need to do is respect one another and work together. And that's an art. So I have skills, and I've learned that I need people who are different to me. The pioneers claim the land. The settlers make it worth living there. They build the roads. They create the maps. They create the policies. And it's that mutual respect and teamwork that does it. But it has to be led by vision.
Ooh, I love that. Yeah, the diversification of skills and abilities merged in a common vision, and obviously the visionary is important because it helps to point that direction. I love everything you're sharing, Steve. What can we, as Christians, as leaders, as the church, what can we learn from this approach that you and Oasis Restore have taken in this specific sector? But what can the church learn from the things that God has been doing through you and Oasis?
Well, I do you know the truth? The truth is I don't know, but I do know this, that if you take Restore as an example, only as an example, why have we called
Mhm.
it Oasis Restore? I should tell you, it's been such a long fight. We had to get the law in this country changed. Through our parliament, a law had to go because a charity, what you'd call a 501c3, a not for profit, wasn't allowed
Uh-huh.
to run a custodial establishment. Never. And so the law had to go through to allow us to do this. And so the government tell us that we are the first charity, 501c3 in your terms, in
Uh-huh.
history to be able to run a custodial establishment, because
Wow.
it's been the job of the state up until now. But it's not just that that we're the first to do this. It's this, that it's called Oasis Restore. So back to a piece of theology, because I think all of our action needs to grow out of theology, but our theology needs to
Mhm.
live. I have been
Mhm.
in churches, and I've witnessed churches through my life. You know, they're constantly preaching about what this Bible story or that Bible story, but the question is, what does it mean? What does it
Mhm.
mean for us today? So here's the thing. You know, Moses taught the people an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. We've already been talking about Moses. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I don't know if you know this, but when Moses said, you know, here's the law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a bone for a bone, a bruise for a bruise, um, all the people went, yeah, okay, Moses, we get that. We've always understood that. They'd always understood it because Hammurabi, the first king of Babylon, 500 years before Moses, had said exactly that. In fact, if you ever go to France and the Louvre Gallery in Paris, you can go and see Hammurabi's code. It's a wonder of the world. It was dug up. It's a stone tablet, a huge stone tablet with laws written over it 500 years before Moses was born. And one of the
Wow.
laws is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a bone for a bone, a bruise for a bruise. So when Moses said that, the people would have said, well, we've been under the influence of the Babylonian Empire. We know that. But here's the funny thing about Moses. He just stopped. If you read Hammurabi's code, look it up, King Hammurabi and his code. You can Google it or whatever. Um, the thing is, it says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And then it says, except for a freedman. A freedman was somebody who'd been a slave and set free. In that case, a fine, a big fine for an eye. In other words, a citizen's life is of more value than a freed slave, and you can just pay a fine. But then it has a category of a presence, a slave who's a slave now, and then it's a small fine. So if you take the eye of a fellow citizen, your eye's got to go. If you take the eye of a freedman, well, you just pay a fine, but your eye's okay. If you take the eye of a slave, well, just pay a little bit. It's nothing. When Moses speaks, he says an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. That's it. Equality. It's still retribution, but it's equality. It's a giant
Hmm.
moral move on. But here's the truth. As you know, Jesus arrives and he says, you've heard it said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You've heard that law of retribution. You've heard the law of the claw. You've heard let the punishment fit the crime. But I'm telling you, that's ancient Bronze Age stuff. No more. No more. It's about restoration. It's about restoration. So we're called Oasis Restore. And all our practices will be based on restoration, therapeutic rather than traumatizing. Trauma is
Wow.
trauma is the Greek word for wound, wounding. And therapy is it comes from the ancient Greek word for healing. In our lives and in our churches, what is wounding to people? In our communities, what's wounding to people? In our schools, in our jobs, in our employment, what are the wounding policies and practices? And how do we bring healing practices? Because it
Mm,
strikes me this is the message of Jesus. So I guess what
mm.
we're always doing is trying to delve into scripture and ask, how do you apply that to the real world in which we live?
Yeah, I love it. Practical theology, putting our beliefs and our faith into action in a practical way. I think this is a perfect segue, Steve, just to mention about your book, A Manifesto for Hope. Can you just maybe just talk a little bit about that, and also where people can get that book and how they can connect with
Yeah,
you?
yeah. Well, the Manifesto for Hope is the book that I published just a few months ago. Well, it was published a few months ago. And I wrote it because, as I said, we work in poor communities. And 2 years ago, one of our students was stabbed to death. Uh,
Mm,
and as and 12 hours later, in another town where we work at the other end of the country, one of our students, a 5-year-old, was murdered by his mother,
wow.
who was suffering with mental health issues, et cetera, et cetera. Because those are the communities we're working in all the time. It's places where we have churches, et cetera. And so I decided I had to write about this thing, because if our goal as Oasis is to build communities where everyone can achieve their God-given potential, we'd failed both of these children. And then
Mm,
I wanted to write about how our governmental systems don't work as the way they should. The systems, people say, are broken. I know they say that in the States as well. And I say about
mhm,
here, it's not that systems are broken. It's that there never was a system of wraparound care, a safety net. We got lots of bits and
mhm,
pieces that don't fit together. And so the book is written about how we heal that. But specifically, it's written about the role of churches in doing that, and the role of other faith groups, and the role of grassroots movements and local charities. In this country, we have that. Do you have that saying, it takes a village to raise a child? Do you say that in the
yes,
States?
yes, we do.
Yeah. Well,
Hmm.
here's what we do in the UK. We say it takes a village to raise a child, and really we think actually it takes a bunch of professionals to do it. And then we leave the village out, the mums, the dads, the grandmothers, the aunts, the uncles, because they're too awkward to work with very often. And yet, if we can create a situation where our statutory agencies, our governmental agencies, work alongside our churches, work alongside our grassroots movements, work alongside local people, in that way, we will once again create the safety net that everyone needs. And that applies to education and health and social services and mental health care, et cetera, et cetera. That's what my book is about. And it's also about the spiritual core of all of that, because you can change the surroundings around everyone. And I've learned this. You can give them housing. We provide housing
Mm,
and education, et cetera. But what about the inner story and the inner voice? And
right.
that's why the journey of spirituality becomes so important. That's what my book's about. A manifesto
I love
for
it.
hope.
Everybody, the book is A Manifesto for Hope: 10 Principles for Transforming the Lives of Children, Young People, and Their Families. Steve, how can people connect with you and learn more about Oasis as well?
Well, you can get the book on Amazon and all booksellers, etc., etc. But Oasis in the UK, as I say, we're in other countries around the world, but Oasis in the UK, we have a website, oasisuk.org, www.oasisuk.org, and from there you can go on a journey into all the different parts of our work, find out more about Restore. It's got its separate website, but everything links to everything, and you can find out more about the book. And I've done a series of podcasts, actually, with leaders on each of the principles in the book. There are 10, as you said. There's a series of podcasts as well to go with it, so it's all there.
That's wonderful. You guys heard it. You can get the book on Amazon, wherever books are sold. You can get the book. The book is A Manifesto for Hope by Steve Chalke. Chalke has an E on the end there. I learned that on this journey. Also, the website is oasisuk.org. I wanted to mention as well, Steve, as we're finishing up here, the AVAIL Journal. If you're watching or listening to this podcast, the AVAIL Journal comes out quarterly. It is the best Christian leadership magazine I have ever seen. It feels good. It looks good. And I believe, Steve, you have an article coming in an upcoming AVAIL edition. Would you agree that it's important to have quality resources for leaders?
Absolutely. I think that's essential. I think the loneliness of the leader, which I've already talked about, needs to be compensated for. We need to recognize it's there. So we need to stimulate our thinking all of the time. I can get so bogged down in what I'm doing that I find myself running on empty. I'm still doing it because I know it's right, but I need new stimulation. I need new insight. So to feed ourselves becomes an extraordinarily important thing. I was going to say, as I finish, that I often say to leaders, because I've talked about vision, as we chatted together. So leaders often say to me, "But I'm so frustrated. I'm so frustrated." And I say this: I've learned through my life that vision and frustration are the same thing. They're just spelt differently. What is vision? Dreaming for, hoping for, longing for, praying for everything that is not yet. What is frustration? It is dreaming for, hoping for, longing for, praying for everything that is not yet. So the more vision you have, the more you have to learn to live with frustration. And that's why we need one another, and we need the kind of resource that AVAIL provides, because that helps feed our vision in the midst of the frustration of walking Christ's way.
Whew, I love it. I never heard that. Vision and frustration are the same, just spelled differently. Well, everybody, if you haven't, you'll be able to claim your free subscription of the AVAIL Journal by going to availjournal.com. Free trial on us in an upcoming, depending on when you hear this or when you watch this, it may already be out, an article in the AVAIL Journal by Steve Chalke entitled Embodied: How a Leader Shapes Culture. Keep an eye out for that. It's a good one. Steve, as we come to the final stretch here, I would love for you to just share maybe a final thought, a final word of encouragement for all of our leaders here at AVAIL.
I think that through the years, I have learned that the simplest things are the best things. I have learned through the struggles of these years just to keep my eyes fixed on Jesus. Jesus once said, as you know, you can sum it all up this way: love God, love your neighbor the way you love yourself. All the rest, he said, hangs on these two great commandments. In other words, all the rest is commentary. If we remember simply this, that Jesus calls us to love God and love people, others, the way we love ourselves. I often say to people, you don't need Greek, you don't need Hebrew, you don't need to understand anything much more than that. Love God and love others. If it chimes with that, if it rhymes with that, if it echoes those two great truths, you're on the right path.
Woo! I love it. I love it. Steve, what an honor for all of us here at AVAIL to just be able to spend some time with you on this podcast. I want to mention on behalf of Dr. Sam Chand, the great Martijn van Tilburg, and our whole AVAIL family, we are so thankful for your leadership. We honor you for the work that you've done, and we bless you. And we're thankful that we can learn from what you're doing there in the UK and around the world. And we pray that it would spread, that the heart and the vision of Oasis would continue to spread and be blessed. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for sharing this time with us.
Thank you, Vigil. Thank you.
Yeah, what a blessing. Hey, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the AVAIL podcast with an amazing global leader, Steve Chalke, all the way from the UK. As always, our heart is to provide you with resources that are going to encourage you and help you. So remember to check out Steve's book, A Manifesto for Hope. Get it on Amazon, anywhere books are sold. Also, if you want more information on Steve and Oasis and everything they're doing, you can go to oasisuk.org. On behalf of AVAIL, my name is Virgil Sierra, lead pastor of Vertical Church, your host right here on this podcast where we get down into the art of leadership every single week. Can't wait to see you next time right here on AVAIL. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the AVAIL podcast with our guest, Steve Chalke. You can connect with Steve on Twitter at Steve Chalke with an E at the end. Find out more about Oasis Movement by going to oasisuk.org. For more leadership resources, check us out at theartofleadership.com. And make sure to claim your free trial subscription of the AVAIL Journal at availjournal.com. As always, I'm your AVAIL podcast host, Virgil Sierra. Muchas gracias. Thank you for connecting with us to learn the art of leadership here at the AVAIL podcast.